Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm very excited about today's guest, about who I can say, I think, as the best compliment I could give apropos to this interview is that she is an actual poet, and that is Jane Greer. Jane was the founder of the Plains Poetry Journal, but today we're here to discuss her own poetry, which is recently published in Love Like a Conflagration from Lambing Press. This is her second collection of poems. Her first was in 1986, Bathsheba on the Third Day, but this new compilation, Love Like a Conflagration, actually includes that first collection as well. So this is basically her collected poems here. Jane, it's a real pleasure to have you on the Catholic Culture Podcast. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. This is exciting.
I really love your poetry. There's no other way of putting it. I posted one of your poems online saying you were a stone cold killer. And the reason I put it that way is because your poetry gives the unusual sense that sometimes I have when, listening to good jazz or something like that. Like there's a real bite to it, and there's like a visceral quality to it that kind of what are the kids saying now? It slaps. I don't know if you've ever heard that that's a pretty recent development, I think, in our language, saying something slaps. Well, your poetry definitely slaps, both in the sonic sense. It's extremely musical, but also in its content, it's got a lot of passion and intensity to it. Despite being very much in traditional forms, and it rhymes, and it has a kind of a danceable rhythm in some senses, and yet it's not. I would not describe it as staid at all. It's very, very passionate and very aggressive in some ways.
Well, that's quite a compliment. I have to tell you that when I read that you said I'm a stone cold killer, I thought, well, that's going on my headstone. But now it's either that or it slaps. I don't know which one of those I'll pick. I try to write poems. I'm not an academic. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. I'm not an academic. So my poems are for normal people who like poetry or who might like poetry, if they could relate to the sound of it or the feel of it or the meaning. So that's what comes out of me, and that's who I'm writing for.
Why don't we go ahead and read a poem so people can get a sense of this? Can we just start with the first poem in the collection? Can you read that one?
Sure. This is a poem called Micha-el, and that's the archangel. We call him Michael, but when El is attached to any Hebrew word, it means God. And so, but Michael is a warrior angel and a fierce protector of God and a fierce enemy of the devil. And I wrote this poem because in our culture, angels have become cute. And I don't think that angels are cute. So that's what engendered this. Micha-el. You lull yourselves with dimple-handed cherubs, simpering in your étagère half-naked, small-breasted maidens, tissue-winged and swooning there on your desktop. All those complacent, fleshy pastel eunuchs posing with harp or horn on the Christmas mantle. You underestimate to your own peril whom we have come from, whom we are acting for, and it's too late now. Suddenly, it's too late to ask for mercy. Mercy is what you'll get, his wide-armed mercy, but you won't like it. He has been with you at your elbow, lovesick, down the millennia. He knows you deeply, yet still encumbers your black hearts with blessings. Willing, unwillful swain, he has wept and waited while you mocked him. Finally now, the muscles of his jawline clench and unclench beneath that holy shadow. Enough is enough. Don't act as though some game's been played unfairly. He's never skimped on profits since he breathed you out of the mud and on your way to heaven, yours for the asking. But you were too intent on what you'd crawled from. You can't begin to dream what you've rejected, what we would give to need his fierce salvation, require his dying. Love like a conflagration shall be yours now. Love like an April river, like a temblor. Love like an avalanche, a midnight bomb blast, finding you hidden, shrieking the air with shards of stained glass windows. Love like a sunstorm, sweeping before it nations, continents, galaxies, and all your hubris. Yes, say your prayers now. This is your precious moment. I, its angel, angry and dark and terrible. God with us, Emmanuel, comes bearing yet more mercy, but you won't like it.
I imagine that most, any poet putting together a collection would choose the first poem in particular carefully. But this is not just the first poem, because the book is divided into various sections. And this one is not in a section. It actually comes before the first section. So why choose to start by threatening the reader?
This poem, I set it apart and I set it first because it does kind of establish the tone and the mood for the book. These are hard emotions, hard feelings. I seem to write poems about suffering. Oh, that sounds bad. I seem to write poems about sin and dealing with the hard things of life and our relationship with God. And I think we need to fear God in the old biblical way of love and fear and respect all combined. And I don't feel a lot of that these days. And much of this book, both parts of it, kind of are trying to go there, are trying to show the might and the power of God, as well as his tenderness.
I wonder if you could explain the structure of the book a little bit.
Oh, sure. Let's start in the back. I included my first book, Bathsheba on the Third Day, in this collection. My publisher thought that was really what he wanted to publish, because in 1986, I was just really I hadn't been published much at all, and very, very famous publisher, Harry Duncan, who had a press called Cummington Press and had published over the decades first books by many poets who went on to great deserved fame. He published Bathsheba on the Third Day, and I do not even remember sending it to him or what occasioned me to do that, but he liked it. And he was a letterpress printer, so he It's a beautiful book. He hand set the type. He hand printed the book, and I wanted to honor that, so I left it in the 4 categories that he put it into. And there is kind of a flow in that second section. There is kind of a nice culmination at the end of that. It again is it's kind of violent, a little bit angry, a little bit bloody in times. There's some sex in there, but it has a nice conclusion. So then the front part of the book, I knew that I wanted to start with Micha-el because that seems to be the tone that I write in, and that seems to be the world that I live in. And then I realized that it was correct to try and have some themes that make sense in my book. And so I took a hard look at the newer poems that I was going to include, and they did seem to fall into 2 pretty strong categories. So the first one, which I named At the Garden of Organic Delight, and that's also the name of the first poem in that little section, that part of the book is all about temptation and sin and wrongheadedness. And then the second part of that new section, which was in the pool at the Bourbon, Orleans, that is also the name of the first poem in that section. That segment is more finding our way, finding my way, although very, very few of these poems are autobiographical. That segment is about learning to see God when he's right in front of us, learning to listen to him, follow him, just love him in a better way. So that's what I came up with for the divisions of the book.
Why don't we hear a piece from the first section then? Let's do a short. This is one of the most, I don't know if it's the most, it might be the most compact poems in the book, Her Green Desire.
It is probably the shortest, yes. Her green desire is thorn and thicket, twisted root, tangle of shoot and tendril, hot and wet, everything overmuch. A wet green paradise through which winds whitely, though she cannot hear it, watery-mouthed, a red-eyed ferret.
Let me ask you this. Is the ferret, is it some kind of traditional iconographical representation of envy? I had that guess. I don't know if it is, or is it just your own kind of representation?
I didn't think of it as envy. I thought of it as maybe the serpent, or because ferrets are kind of snake-like, or of sin, of temptation. So there's this huge, rich, teeming desire, but slithering through it is this watery-mouthed, red-eyed ferret that could, if it's mishandled, turn into sin.
Can you read that one more time, just because it's short? I'd like to be able to hear that a second time.
Her green desire is thorn and thicket, twisted root, tangle of shoot and tendril, hot and wet, everything overmuch, a wet green paradise through which winds whitely, though she cannot hear it, watery-mouthed, a red-eyed ferret.
I feel like I have all these cinematic references for this imagery, because now I'm thinking of a scene in The Big Lebowski where he's in the bathtub and these German goons come and throw a ferret in his bath. Have you seen that?
Yes, I've seen that a couple of times. Love it.
Anyway, yes. So that the ferret that's the most menacing I've ever seen a ferret be. So that's I think that's the only other menacing ferret image that I have in my head.
Well, you've just made me very happy, because my 6 little lines here apparently kind of got you where you live. And so that's what all poets try to do. So thank you.
It's interesting too, because, I didn't have either of these thoughts until we started talking about it. I find, I really find discussion, I don't have a lot of thoughts about things, films or works of fiction or, poems, at least on the first couple readings, at least, unless I start talking about them, and then having a conversation kind of elicits all this stuff that I didn't know was in there. So I find it very helpful in where literature is concerned.
I find that that's true for me and for a lot of people that I know. And just that you would read a poem that you maybe didn't get much out of more than once says a lot about you, I think. And you're the kind of reader that we hope to have, because often the first reading of a poem won't give anybody much, but the second and the third, with any luck, there will be some gold there.
Sure. What was the time span over which you wrote these poems? Were you kind of writing them ever since that first collection, or were they? Was there more kind of like a recent resumption of your poetic activities?
There was a very recent resumption, and I'll tell you the story, but I can't explain the story. Only God can do that. In the early 90s, my life was such that I just couldn't keep doing everything I was doing. And so one of the things that I could give up without, endangering my family or my job or anything like that was Plains Poetry Journal. So that's why I quit publishing Plains Poetry Journal in 1993. But also, for some reason, I didn't write a poem. I didn't even think of a line for a poem or a rhythm for a poem for 30 years. I went about my life. I had a job I liked. I had a wonderful husband, and we had a child, and we were active in the community. And so I did all those things, and I had a really lovely life, but I didn't and I couldn't write a poem. And I mourned that more than once. I'd mourn it and then kind of say, all right, let go of it now. And then I'd see something or hear something, and I'd mourn it. I'd have to mourn it all over again. But I was pretty much reconciled to the fact that I just wasn't going to write poetry anymore. And then 2 years ago, almost to the day, my husband and I were visiting New Orleans. We're both North Dakotans, and so New Orleans is the most foreign place in this country, especially if you're from North Dakota. And we love New Orleans, but I was sitting alone in a little cafe, and all of a sudden I had an overpowering urge to write a poem. I had 2 lines of the poem. I had the rhythm, and I hadn't felt that feeling for 30 years, but I knew exactly what it was. And I didn't have paper or pen, but that's okay, because I always have composed on a typewriter or now a computer, just always have. And so I wrote a first draft of this poem on my phone, and I was off. I was writing poetry again. And so I'm not trying to assign blame to God or anything like that, but because there is no blame. Everything works out beautifully, but my poetry tap was turned off for 30 years, and then in that little cafe it got turned back on again. So most of these poems in the first section are within the last 2 years. A few of them are older.
Wow, that's really amazing. So you regretted that you weren't writing poems, but you weren't feeling the urge to write them either.
I call it grief, because it was taken from me, or I didn't have it anymore. I had urge to write poetry, but I did not have a poem issuing from me. I always write with a line that won't leave me alone, or often it's a meter that just won't leave me alone. And I wasn't receptive to either of those two things for the 30 years that I didn't write poetry. And I wanted to be, but I just couldn't make it happen.
Yeah, well, what's hard to explain about that is that you clearly are a poet, and you don't really stop being a poet. Somebody doesn't, I don't think, stop being a poet. You don't actually lose the gift. But that is, I can see why you would say you wouldn't be able to explain that, because it's very, very interesting. But clearly you had the gift then and you have it now. So
I look back over those, pretty much it's 3 decades. And I look back over that time and I am full of regret, but I don't know of anything that I could have done differently. It just was what it was. And now I look at where I am and I think, well, those 30 years are what got me here. So there was a plan somewhere, and here's where I am now.
Well, maybe there's nothing to regret. You were doing what you needed to do for your family, and it just wasn't the place you were in your life, So it sounds providential, because you don't feel, not that I know anything about writing poetry, but these poems don't feel rusty to me anyway.
I'm as surprised as anyone that this is happening again, and at how easily I was able to do it again. So it's all just a marvelous plan, and I'm just kind of, I'm riding the river, wherever this takes me. But I take it a lot more seriously than I did 30 years ago. I feel that now this is my job. And so I'm a lot more attentive when I feel a poem wanting to crawl out.
That's great. Well, I'm happy that you've resumed, and I know many others who were familiar with your work back then as a poet and as a publisher are happy too, because you got some really great praise from a number of our Catholic poets: Samuel Hazo, Mike Aquilina, Tony Esolen, and James Matthew Wilson, Ryan Wilson, all these, but they all spoke so highly of it. So,
well, the back cover of my book with the blurbs on it, that's going on my headstone too.
That's great. Was that poem the first one you started writing again? Was that the Cafe Pontalba? Was that the one you were referring to?
Yes, that's the one I
can
did.
Can we hear that one?
In desperation on my phone. Sure. Okay, this is the poem that came to me after 30 years of silence. At the Cafe Pontalba. It is quite pleasant at the Cafe Pontalba in the hot mid-morning at a window table, the slow fans, the air thick as water, here where Charters crosses St. Peter. Out there, in the glare of the white cathedral, life lifts its head. At some subtle signal, spooled from the alleys, deliberate movement slides into focus on shimmering pavement. Hair braiders, drummers, portrait painters, acrobats, charlatans, shoe shiners, ranters, henna queens, drag queens, the next Marsalis, the next Vermeer, the lucky dog seller. In yesterday's clothes, in sleep-deprived glory, hungry, hungover, resolute, weary. Today, as every dry day, they return to carry on, or to try again. In here, though, it is cooler, dimmer. Drive and vocation are simply rumors, and action seems borderline indecent. In the Cafe Pontalba, it is very pleasant.
Well, that's kind of ironic considering that this place was actually what started you, writing poems again.
It's just it's a love affair with that city and with the view that I was looking over from the open window in the cafe.
Let's talk a little bit about your early training or whatever you had in poetry. How did you learn to write? I mean, how did you learn to write these forms, and at a time when the traditional craft was out of favor?
That, too, is a mystery even to me. I didn't have a lot of training in high school or in college, and bear in mind that I was an English major in college. I think there were a couple of poetry classes that I took, and those were what were offered. But I've always been a bottomless reader. I would read anything I could get my hands on. So the first poet who ever caught my attention, like, oh, this is something different here, that I remember is, of course, and this is everybody's answer, Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think he's everybody's first favorite poet because I learned that the possibility of the power and the glory of language from him. When I was a teenager, I also discovered Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I think she's really underappreciated today. And from her, I learned that poetry could be musical and lyrical. And from then, I don't remember a lot of favorite poets. I've always been more about a poem than about a poet's body of work. I don't think there are many poets who have a great body of work, but even a pretty good poet can write a miraculous poem. And so those are what all my life I've tended to concentrate on. And I started writing poetry in high school. And it was, of course, it was all love poetry and kind of social commentary poetry, because that's what you do when you're in high school. Then I just kept writing and reading from then on. But I haven't had a lot of training. I haven't had a lot of heroes. Today, in spite of the fact that we've had 50 years of free verse and not a lot of formalism, I think today there are dozens of good poets writing who, and by good, I of course mean that they write the kind of poetry I like, which has some form to it, has some compression to it. It doesn't just sound like a jotting in a diary. There are a lot of good poets writing that way, and a large percentage of them are Catholic.
Sure, yeah, that definitely seems to be the case, and it's not all that surprising, in the same way that it's not that surprising that so many advocates of classical education are Catholic or became Catholic. People who are interested in kind of the universal human ways of being, tend to head in that direction. I remember Tony Esolen when we talking about how poetry is something that every human culture has had. It's like the one art form that every human culture has had, and somehow we lost it to a large degree in the 20th century. At least that's something that any ordinary person would have been aware of or interested in, which it had been before. So it's definitely a good sign that more and more people are writing. I mean, it comes down to music, a lot of it, Poetry has to be musical to some degree. At least that's the way that I connect with it. Even if I don't understand a poem, I can connect with it on a musical level if it's musical.
Well, I think it does too. And really, that goes back thousands of years. The first poetry was a combination of poetry, music, and dance in the caves that we all lived in. And so somehow our bones and our brains know this, and that's what we love. But we sometimes we can unlearn that love, I think.
Well, can we hear Because God Wanted It? This is from the second section of the first half.
Because God wanted it. I stood alone in my dark backyard to grieve uncountable wrongs that I had yet to receive. What had undone me? Simply that a friend wronged me in ways she claimed not to intend. Still, I was Moses, grinding that gold to dust beneath my righteous heel, my hurt robust and richly fed. I was a walking bruise, wandering old familiar avenues, so old and so familiar and so grim. My heart's metrics a loud discordant hymn. There in the cloudy dark I shunned the word. Breakers of pain were what I more preferred. Over and over driven to revisit our every utterance and each exquisite pause and riposte. My peak was blackest, yes, yes, to the devil's thoughtful, hot caress, yes, to some fracture that might not be mended. I stoked my little hurt to hate most splendid, and in that fever found surpassing pleasure, too urgent to rebuke, too rich to measure. Downfall that very nearly felt devout. Then the clouds parted and the moon came out, large and unsparing, full in my livid face, substantiation of a saving grace. Raise a doxology to that brisk shake, that light whose suddenness knocked me awake, delivered me embroiled in sin's commission. I had not prayed, did not yet feel contrition, was not yet sorry, humbled, or ashamed. In the very act of straying, I was claimed. Because God wanted it, because God could, because God loves me with my speck of good, because the Holy Spirit over the bent world broods, I was redeemed impenitent.
Yeah, I love that poem. I think it's the only predestination poem that I'm familiar with.
I've never thought of it in those terms. I'll have to ponder that. This was, I said before that few of my poems are autobiographical, strictly autobiographical. This one is. I really experienced this just like this. And I didn't think of it in terms of, what did you call it?
Predestination?
Predestination. Yeah, I thought of it as just overwhelming love that I did not deserve, and yet I felt, and yet it changed me in that moment on the inside, and I knew I was loved, and I knew I was over this really bad blackness that was taking over me, this darkness. I was past that now at this point.
How has your spiritual life as a Catholic affected your life as a poet and vice versa?
That's a beautiful question. They affect each other. And I think if I lived a perfect life, there would be no line between my life as a Catholic and my poetry. But of course, I don't live a perfect life, and I'm a stumbling Christian and a stumbling Catholic. So there is a line. but they inform each other greatly. And even though not all of my poems are about God or Christ or any kind of a holy subject, that reality, I hope, is always in them. I mean it to be in them, and I hope I hope they read that way. I hope people read them and get that there's a holiness there, even when I'm talking about awful things. And my poetry also helps me to, well, it has helped me to be more intentionally grateful to God, but also to appreciate the Bible more. The literature of the Bible is actually leading me into a new kind of spirituality. So, yeah, they're very closely connected.
Just a quick break to let you know what's happening in the rest of the CatholicCulture.org podcast network. The biggest news is that over at Catholic Culture Audiobooks, James Mayevsky has started his most ambitious production yet, an unabridged recording of St. Augustine's book On Christian Doctrine, one of his most famous books alongside The City of God and the Confessions. On Christian Doctrine was one of the first books ever devoted entirely to the art of scriptural interpretation, but its content is even more varied than you might expect from that description, so I highly encourage you to check it out. Just find Catholic Culture Audiobooks in your podcast app. Now, funnily enough, two of the other poets mentioned in this interview with Jane Greer are featured in our two other podcasts, one of those being Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina. If you didn't know, Mike is a poet as well as a patristics writer, and later in this interview, Jane mentions having published some of his poems back in the day. This month, Mike is covering one of the most controversial church fathers ever, namely Origen. And meanwhile, on Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, we are having James Matthew Wilson, who's a 5-time Catholic Culture Podcast guest and one of the other poets who wrote a blurb for Jane Greer's latest book. He'll be joining James Mayevsky and I to discuss Ingmar Bergman's classic movie Wild Strawberries, which is on the Vatican film list. If you appreciate our podcasts at CatholicCulture.org, please know that we run on donations. So if you'd like to help us out and keep us going, you can always go to CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. You mentioned talking about things that are ugly. You have a lot of poems dealing with lust, seemingly. Lust or things related to it, like, not just in the sort of the physical sense, but people having affairs, whatever their motives are. It gets into obviously the psychological element of these things as well. I wonder if we could hear the last poem in the book, actually. This is one of two poems that has a nice two-part structure that I like. This one, Song of the Passerby, and early in the book, At the Center of the Universe, they both have this kind of two-part reversal structure that I enjoy.
Right. I love two-part structures. I love dichotomies where I love the yin and yang symbol where the two shapes are kind of folded into each other and you're not sure where one stops and the other one starts. This is Song of the Passerby. Lovers make their own light darkly with their breath, tonguing out some shining, clinging shibboleth. As they lie divining little dawns all night, bent upon hope, lovers grope for a small death of death. Lovers cast their own dark lightly all around them, stumbling onto lovers, leave them as you found them, murmuring under covers, urgent in the park, what they find, keening, unkind, seems to astound them.
I don't know what kind of parks you've been going to, but there's a lot of there's a lot of parks in these poems. Or untoward things are going on. It seems to be a recurring motif.
Well, I used to live by a park, and it was on a river, so it had vast marshy wetlands attached to it, and in the summer it was very steamy. And I think in my mind I mixed that up with the Garden of Eden, which also was the most beautiful place, and yet look what happened there.
Well, it kind of goes back to your image in Her Green Desire of this kind of overgrowth, this untamed, unordered wilderness of vegetation that kind of has this sense of promiscuity and danger to it. Since you mentioned this, could you please read Pastoral? Because this is relevant to this park that you just lived by, that you just mentioned.
Pastoral. There is a primly tended park where in the noon sun shadows quiver. There is a muddy, blood-warm river murmuring lies from dark to dark, and in between a snarl of grass the mowing man in the heat forgot. Knee-deep, waist-deep, steaming in hot sun, it lets no lovers pass. Young men and women shed their clothes without relief among the trees. Ardor is dampened by degrees, but in the long grass something grows importunate of appetite and roots its deepest self in mire, waiting for those whose fresh desire will fell them, come the night.
So, well, I'm imagining that must be the ferret again, but maybe not.
It's that darn ferret. I have a number of, my mother died 27 years ago, but she read my first book, which these poems are in, and never wanted to talk about it. I shocked my mother with some of these poems, but I think that they're thoughts that almost everybody has. So they just kind of, that's where my mind goes sometimes. Like, what does this look like, and what is it really? What is really happening here?
Right. Well, the last stanza of that, the first of those two, the Song of the Passerby, is interesting to me. The idea is, I don't know, there seems to be like kind of a social contagion that one wishes to avoid in passing by these lovers and not kind of looking too closely or sticking around to see the action, so to speak.
I think what I intended was more in that second paragraph, that there is something marvelous, miraculous, because of its very privacy going on, and so leave them alone. Don't bother them. Leave them alone. What they're discovering things that astound them.
Right, but they're not necessarily good things.
They're not necessarily good, but they're not necessarily bad. Everything is context. I try, when I write about sex, I try to make it more than what's just on the surface. And people can kind of find their own way through that poem, but it is, man and woman, that is a holy mystery. And we make it bad and disordered and dark so much, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I like to leave the possibility open that it isn't wrong and disordered, that we might be looking at a huge blessing happening.
That one was, of course, from the original collection, Bathsheba on the Third Day. Both of those were. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about your work back then for Plains Poetry Journal. I mean, I really only know about this from reading the Wikipedia entry on you. So I really need you to explain the historical context of this. I mean, clearly, it said that it was part of the advance guard of the new formalism, I think is how Wikipedia put it. That to me says, poets like Dana Gioia, I don't know, Richard Wilbur maybe before that, maybe kind of doing his own thing before that. But can you explain to people what the new formalism was? Well, first of all, do you think that's an accurate representation of what you were doing there?
Looking back on it, possibly. I know that my publisher firmly believes that. Here's the story of Plains Poetry Journal. I was in my late 20s. I was just getting a poem published here and there once in a while, but I really lived in a world devoid of people who liked poetry, who sought poetry out, people who knew why the world would be impoverished if there were no poetry. I didn't know anybody like that. I read a lot of poetry and I disliked most of it because it was in that very prosaic, free verse. It sounded like a recorded conversation. There was not a lot of art to it, or it felt like no art was even tried to be put into it. And a poem is a made thing. It is made by a person. It's a work of art. So I didn't like a lot of what I was reading, and there was an editor that I had become friends with who suggested that I start my own poetry journal and publish poetry that I thought was good. And I was young enough and stupid enough that I thought that sounded like a really great idea. So I founded and published Plains Poetry Journal from 1981 through 1993. It was quarterly. Most years it was quarterly. I put out 37 issues, and I just went back and did a spreadsheet because I'm toying with the idea of trying to do a best of Plains Poetry Journal book. I would really like to do that. But I published more than 550 different poets. And those poets included Tony Esolen, Gail White, R.S. Gwynn, Mike Aquilina. That's where I first met him. I published some of his poetry. And I did it totally by myself because, like I said, I was young and dumb, and it never occurred to me to get help. I didn't apply for grants. I paid for it itself most years. And then, like I said, my life just got to be such that something needed to give, and that was what gave. But I did not feel that I was part of any movement. Looking back, maybe I was, but I don't remember being aware of it. I remember feeling pretty isolated a lot of the time. So now to have, poets of the rank of Dana Gioia, even to have my name put into the same Wikipedia paragraph with his is quite amazing to me.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're deserving of it, really. Mentioning Tony Esolen, yeah, it just occurred to me that he went through a similar journey. You mentioned publishing his poems, and those probably, for all I know, were some of the last original poetry that he wrote before the publication last year of his cycle, The Hundredfold, about which I interviewed him. And, because he had been translating poems, but he hadn't been writing original poetry for quite some time. I don't know if it was 30 years for him, but it was a similar journey in some ways.
I believe it was almost that long, and he poured all of his poetic talent and genius into translation. I didn't have that to pour myself into. So he was even so so the first thing he does after this long poetry hiatus is to produce a book like The Hundredfold, which
pretty ambitious project.
That's a lifetime's worth of a poem right there. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's great. One of my favorite, maybe my favorite poem in the book, just as an experience, is Bourbon Neat. That one, I don't know anything about bourbon. I got to be honest. I couldn't summon the taste of bourbon into my imagination as we speak, but I still loved the poem.
You mean my poem didn't make you want to learn about bourbon?
Well, it was kind of scary. I get the part about the interior feeling of it. I mean, that's pretty clear. But yeah, can we hear that one? This is the one that inspired me to say you were a stone cold killer.
I'm going to be sending you a bottle of bourbon.
Okay, great.
Bourbon Neat. Thin to a filament of fire and fall, web of hot wire, down my dark veins, to bundle me in my black root hollow. What heat you lose, such heart I gain. Such heart I gain, pale amber swallow, kindles the bone where you coil and hiss. Whose supple lover on a silk pillow seizes the blood in a blaze like this. I like my poems to have several layers of meaning that are discoverable, but to me, this is like a kind of a one-layer poem, but it's an homage. It's an homage to bourbon. And not that I drink a lot of bourbon, one little sip is good for me, but I do love that little sip. What I was trying to do in this poem was almost exclusively to do things with language, to show what language can do with the rhymes and the metrics and getting entangled in itself, kind of like that little stream of bourbon going down your throat. It was pure. It was almost a language exercise for me to write this poem, and bourbon happened to be the topic.
Well, it's great, and it slaps, It's got a lot of things that I like in a poem. I like those pivots where you repeat a phrase, as you do in the middle of the poem. Such heart I gain. I always like that. It also has an alliteration quality. I don't know if it would be going in the wrong direction to compare it to Anglo-Saxon verse or not. What do you think? Is there anything of that in there, or is it just kind of a similar poetic device, but not related to that?
Oh, I hope so. I hope it's got some kenning in it, some Anglo-Saxon verse, because I adore that. I don't think I could pull that off in a long poem, but I was trying to do it here. The alliteration in both halves of a line. So yeah, thank you. You just paid me a very, very high compliment if you heard a little bit of that going on.
Great. Well, it's especially evident in the second line, web of hot wire down my dark veins, because then you have the two different alliterated sounds in each half of the line. But yeah, no, that's like my favorite kind of, that's what appeals to me in a poem. I like that sound, that Anglo-Saxon kind of alliterative verse quite a lot. That tends to make it more of a visceral experience for me than rhyme does. I mean, rhyme is great, but the alliterative verse thing.
It sounds to me like you are very you're ear driven, you're ear centric. You like the sound of poetry, and I love that. And again, I think that is a throwback thousands of years to how everything started. I think what you like about this is in everybody's DNA, but we've kind of learned to scorn it a little bit, and all of the things that make it clear that a poem has been made and shaped and worked on and really fussed over. We've kind of learned to scorn all of that, and I'm hoping that changes.
Well, one of my favorite things about your poetry is that it both has this kind of this formal quality to it and this kind of sense of abandon, which you don't find equally in all of the modern poets who use rhyme and meter. I like Richard Wilbur a lot. His poem has been criticized as being kind of, I don't know, a little bit. I don't know what the word people would use. I used the word staid earlier to say that your poems were not staid. There's a little bit of it. They tend not to be. I don't want to say anything inaccurate about Richard Wilbur here. They're not always that effusive in their feeling. There's definitely feeling there.
No, maybe you're saying that he was more of a gentleman than I am a proper lady. Maybe that's it.
I don't know about that.
Because his poetry is beautiful, but it does, mine and his do have different tones.
Yeah. Well, it appeals to the heart more for me, as well as the I don't know about the ear. Both yours and Richard Wilbur's poems appeal to the ear very much. Now, it's just that's the reason I made that comparison, is because both very gifted with forms that have fallen out of fashion for a long time. But yeah, his poems. I wouldn't want to say that you're less of a lady, but it's just I do feel that when it comes to art, the rules the rules are of those things are kind of thrown out the window to some extent, and properly so.
Yeah, they disappear, those rules. Everything. There's no. I used to say in my manifesto that I sent people who were submitting poems to Plains Poetry Journal. I would say that no subject is taboo. No subject is taboo. Everything depends on what you do with it, how you treat it.
There's maybe 3 more that I'd like to hear, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so here's one that you mentioned when we were talking. It sounded like you might be interested in reading it. This is Feminist Androgyne. This is from Bathsheba on the Third Day. All of these ones that I'd like to hear are. This one might warrant some explanation beforehand, I suppose.
Yes. I think it was 83 or 4. A photographer named Nancy Burson used a computer to feed photographs in and then print out a photograph that merged all those facial features. So there's even there's a book with a lot of her work in it from back in the mid 80s, and it is fascinating. But that didn't exist when I saw my first composite that she had done. She formed this one image by feeding photographs of 6 men and 6 women selected at random into a computer, and that computer was programmed to merge their facial features and produce one photograph. And it looks human, but it doesn't look human. It looks female, but it also looks male. I just couldn't stop looking at it. And so this poem was engendered by that photograph. Feminist Androgyne. Here on this page I am poured out like water, child of time 6, my father and my mother, fruit of adulterated seed, blurred daughter, born unregenerate, your long-dreamed lover. Prophet and ghost and cipher. I was made most digitally. My parents put their heads together. Input, output. I was laid. Pure printout from their cold collective beds. No vague hermaphrodite. I wrench your breath. Rally those old misshapen, desperate dreams you thought you'd shed. New snakeskin, sweet false death. They grow back stronger, garment without seams. Charismatic, mine is a tongue not human. Like smoke or an ill-healed scar, my smudge of hair. I wear few shadows, yet am a holy woman. Does that astonish you? Look, if you dare, you who gaze in a mirror and go blind. Satan, Adam, Eve in her new-fleshed power. I am more than kin, my dear, and less than kind. What wouldn't you give to have me for an hour? What was fun about writing Feminist Androgyne was that I was able to steal things from all over and use them in the poem. For instance, there are biblical quotes in the poem from Psalm 22. It says, one of the lines is, I am poured out like water and all of my bones are out of joint. Well, that's in the first line of my poem. Shakespeare in Hamlet says to the king, a little more than king and less than kind. And that line is in my poem too, because that line always fascinated me, the sound of it. So I stole a lot from a lot of different sources and put a word or two of all that in my poem.
That's interesting. So when I read this, I of course looked up this image. Maybe I'll link to that on the show notes for this episode. But yeah, no, it was interesting. It is a kind of a strange image. I will say that I think your poem was more striking for me than the image itself. I certainly didn't feel particularly compelled to spend an hour with this with this being. It was just slightly uncanny. Is how I would describe it.
Oh, it's very uncanny, and I think what drew me was the fact that it had even been done, that it could be done, and kind of what that might bode for the future. I mean, this was way before cloning, but I sort of had a vague idea of that without knowing what it was, I think, in the back of my mind. Like, is something like this coming? And apparently it was.
The next one I'd like to do is The Haunting. That's on page 70. This is one of my favorites.
The Haunting. When struck, timbre of heartwood, heft of stone when weighed, uneasy wrapping of cold flesh, not flesh, across your back. Each more than wish, less than desire, leaving you unalone in singular camaraderie of grief. These ghosts walk through no walls, hurl no book to your floor, startle you most in your own look, sometimes from a mirror. Your bed is safe so long as you sleep. No wisps of ether they, solid as smoke, sweet in a blaze of October, thick as the scent of April under cover of late intractable March. Hard company, they grow young in your old age. They mean to stay, these ghosts of love you never gave away.
This is a very powerful idea of these kind of regrets of love ungiven, and almost the sense that if you don't give it, then it becomes something else, something dead.
Maybe something dead that increases in scariness as the years go by. It increases its demanding attention from you the older you get, the more you think about things you didn't do.
Let's close with another very interesting poem called Twice Betrayed.
Okay, Twice Betrayed, and I'm not going to explain this. I want to read it and see what happens. Twice Betrayed. See my winding sheet, sloughed like a skin of scales, 4 days dust at my feet, foul as entrails. Take away the stone, cut like a sword into me. Back through hell I was blown violently. Now I know what I've read these years in your speechless eyes. The easy bones of the dead tell only lies. Unbind him and let him go, as if we had reached an end. Do you love me enough, old friend, to make it so?
Okay, let me just process this for a minute. Okay, so when I first read this, I don't know how I managed to be this dumb, but when I first read this, for some reason I was thinking of the resurrection of Christ rather than the resurrection of Lazarus, which is obviously the immediate reference with take away the stone, right? For some reason that just wasn't registering for me. So I was thinking directly about the resurrection of Christ. And at the time, I thought that the speaker was death. But now I feel like I'm probably wrong because I was missing some obvious quotes there.
You know, wow. Now I need to think about it some more. I had written it as if Lazarus were talking, but you just kind of took it to a whole different level. That when death says those two lines, if death were saying those two lines, they would have totally different meanings, which I kind of like. I'll have to think about that. I told you there's no wrong interpretation of a poem. So, and you've just kind of given me an idea of a meaning that I didn't intend, but maybe very valid.
Well, when you say back through hell I was blown, that seems to indicate like limbo, basically, right? If Lazarus is the speaker, then that would be the hell that you're talking about. It's not the hell of damnation, but just the whatever we call it, the place of waiting. And then the last, unbind him and let him go, as if we had reached an end. Do you love me enough, old friend, to make it so? That's kind of what I was trying to figure out. And that's part of the reason I was thinking that the speaker was death, and also trying to think why it was twice betrayed. What are the two betrayals? So I'm still, even if it is Lazarus, I'm still not quite understanding the last bit.
Well, I've always felt sorry for Lazarus. He has to go through it twice. He has to go through death twice. And it's such a celebration in the Bible when he is raised up. And a little part of me just wondered, well, how does he feel about all this?
Well, so twice betrayed would refer to him being allowed to die the first time and then having to do it again. So, all right, that's interesting. So on my initial interpretation, I'm not sure what I would think that the betrayal would be the resurrection. If the speaker was death, the resurrection of Lazarus would be the betrayal. And yet, so the winding sheet would belong to death, but it wouldn't be covering death. It would be the winding sheet around, well, I was thinking Christ, but, Lazarus or whoever. But it's death's winding sheet, in a sense. And at the end, I was thinking he was asking Christ, because presumably death being not necessarily a malicious being as personified might actually want death to be over completely. So he would be saying, well, this is a resurrection, but it's not the final end of all death at the end there. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Really, I think that's a lot to chew on. I think I'm going to have to ponder that a long time. It isn't anything that occurred to me, but that's the miracle of words. Sometimes when you put them together, they have a mind of their own. They have, I like your interpretation, and I'm going to think about it after we're done.
So, but you were thinking this is basically Lazarus still kind of like processing and working through his conflicting feelings about this whole thing.
Yes, I'm just giving him a voice because he doesn't get one in that story.
Well, we could end on a happy one. How about the pool at the Bourbon Orleans?
Okay.
We don't really have to discuss it, but it's just a nice one of the more unambiguously positive poems. Even if I forget what travertine means, I looked it up when I first read it, and now I've forgotten.
It's everywhere. It's a tan, hard stone that gets quarried. In the pool at the Bourbon Orleans. Behold the empty courtyard with its army of pristine lounges guarding the empty pool. Empty but for a beach ball, trapped, untroubled, spinning and skimming like a drunken fool, making Venn diagrams on the water's surface, skidding and tilting, perhaps randomly, perhaps not, from edge to travertine edge. Hold in your mind the glad captivity, the lavish nonchalance, the willingness to be blown and batted, possibly ignored, instructed only by small breaths of wind in a game that seems to be its own reward, aimless and fruitless and purposeless, perhaps, but altogether pleasing to the Lord.
Great talking to you, Jane. I really enjoyed it, and congratulations on this great piece of work you've done.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you and see you and talk with you, and I really appreciate you doing this. Can't wait for it to come out.